This was the first COP that formally acknowledged that fossil fuels are the biggest contributor to the climate problem.
It is surprising that this is science, this is knowledge that has been there for a very long time, but it's only sort of, I think, at this COP where this was more of an acknowledgement.
But you also determined and you also agreed that we need climate financing. So a lot of pledges were made.
Even though Africa does not emit as much as the developed nations, but then we suffer way more consequences of climate-related issues than the rest of the world.
I think a big part of what came out from the last COP that's important for us to focus on was this was the first COP that formally acknowledged that fossil fuels are the biggest contributor to the climate problem. Of course, there were different countries that had different opinions on how strong that language should have been, but the fact that this was formally accepted, I think, is an important milestone. What that means for Africa is that if the world is going to formally or begin to shift from the fossil fuels, we need to think as a continent, how do we prepare for that future? How do we make sure that we are leading we're leading the charge in terms of the development of renewable energy, starting to think about things like electric vehicles and just things that are a post-fossil future. It might still be a while before that comes, but I think the smart thing for Africa to do would be to begin to look at that future and work towards that future.
COP28 is back in the spirit of sort of collaboration, another opportunity to, again, bring voices together. But ultimately, conversations around the loss and damage fund finally almost escalated. Perhaps one of the biggest outputs we would say is and in spite this bigger conversation that we've been having since the 70s, I think the previous COP is really where we are acknowledging, in a very sort of clear and distinct way that the proliferation of fossil fuels and the use of fossil fuels is the cause of the climate crisis. It is surprising that this is science, this is knowledge that has been there for a very long time, but it's only sort of, I think, at this COP where this was more of an acknowledgement, across the different governments, which is very useful because, even from a policy point of view, from an action point of view, these are the kind of things that have slowed down action in this area, to be honest. So I think that was probably the one of the bigger outputs, and it's unfortunate that that is the output because we still, have all of these realizations around Africa as a continent, and thinking about us in terms of the scope of finance that is required. We're talking about trillions, across the continent for us to be able to adapt to the impacts of climate change, but also for us to make this transition to a lower carbon economy. So in as much as governments are talking about this, the realization that the scale of finance that is required and what has actually been committed, what has actually been put on the table is just not meeting that commitment. So a lot of conversations around that, but what that translates to is really where the big question and the big concern is, because it's not translating into real action.
One of the outcomes that came both from the Africa Climate Summit and the COP28 was the fact that we admitted the planet, as we admitted that oil was one of the biggest contributors of the climate crisis. But you also determined and you also agreed that we need climate financing. So a lot of pledges were made. And that's where the opportunity is for young people. Because with these pledges come new openings and new doors. For example, there was a lot of money that was set aside to go into agriculture and smart agriculture and everything that's on that. So it's now for young people to tap into the agricultural sector and say, what can I do? Can I start a small fishery? Can I start a small, how can I do a smart farming and everything? There was a lot of money that went into energy, clean energy and everything. So it's now for the youth to think, what can we do about solar? What can we do about such other kinds of briquettes or anything else? So it's actually much more of, for young people, it's much more of a job creation resource than anything else.
I would highlight the climate finance issues. One key aspect of the outcome was the agreement to begin the operationalizing of the loss and damage fund which is a fund that is set aside to help developing countries cope with the disasters of climate-related nature. So that will go a long way to help African countries, because as the data shows, even though Africa does not emit as much as the developed nations, but then we suffer way more consequences of climate-related issues than the rest of the world.